Well, good morning and thank you for being here. My name is Gary Loew. I am the recently appointed Director of Expertising for the American Philatelic Society, but my role is mostly that of philatelist and postal historian. This morning I want to deal with what is probably going to be the nerdiest presentation of this series among the Pan-Africa group. The subject of my talk is solving the mystery of specimen stamps' irregular blocks. And you can see an example on the screen there of the irregular block that I'm alluding to. But as far as the agenda for this morning, I want to start off with a definition of what a specimen stamp is. And I'll show you a really exciting example of the first specimen stamp. The printing of specimens is a subject that can get very technical. I'll only be doing a brief overview it here. What gets interesting, I think, however, is the ordering and distribution by the UPU, by the Universal Postal Union, of the specimen stamps. So the printers produced the specimens, but it was to an order from the Universal Postal Union as they were going to distribute it to the member postal authorities. We'll look at some simple multiples, pairs, obviously the place to start, some strips, and then we'll take a look at that weird irregular block that I showed you on the opening slide. But first, it's time for a pop quiz. I love pop quizzes. So, why are we here today? Anybody? We have nothing else to do. That's one explanation. The one I much prefer, however, is that because we are all philatelists. Then the question becomes, why are we philatelists? I know it's a difficult question to ponder. Let me show you one answer, at least the answer according to Scott Adams. So you might want to take a moment and read that. This is a Dilbert cartoon from 1990. Why do people collect stamps? Because they're valuable. Why are they valuable? Because people collect up all the good ones. So you collect stamps because they're valuable, and they're valuable because you collect them? Right, says Dilbert. And Dogbert says, sounds pretty fulfilling. And Dilbert responds, to be honest, I do it just for the adrenaline rush. And speaking only for myself now, I do it for the adrenaline rush too. All right, so what is a specimen stamp? Marcus Samuel wrote the first authoritative book on the subject, entitled Specimen Stamps of the Crown Colonies from 1857, before the UPU, through 1948. It was a 76 book. He stopped at 1948. And he said, a specimen, a stamp or a stamp proof that has been provided or preserved as a sample for which no payment has been made to the revenue and that has been defaced to prevent its postal or fiscal use. All right. That's Marcus Samuel's view. James Bendon wrote the by far most authoritative book on the subject of UPU specimens. Came out in 1988. He did a revised edition that is just a stunning volume in 2015. UPU specimen stamps, his range was 1878, so just post the Universal Postal Union, well, post the General Postal Union, the successor to the UPU. And he says that there are, in general speaking, there's 12 kinds of specimen stamps. Postal authority specimens are used to notify local postmasters of an issuance. And the first specimen that we'll see is actually precisely that. Printers' reference specimens are kept by the printers for their own internal reference. All printers, all postage stamp printers, kept archives, and the reference material inside is a printer's reference specimen. Official reference specimens are kept as post office are kept in the postal reference collection, also by the Crown agents when it came to the British Empire. Presentation specimens are just that. They were given to visiting dignitaries. So regardless of what the issuing postal authority was, when dignitaries came and were touring the local postal authority, they were given these presentation packages. They were all marked specimens. Stamp printing specimens are basically marketing tools issued and distributed by the printers as samples. Something very similar, and I will tell you it is difficult to differentiate among the different types in many cases, but a printer sample proof is just that, delivered by the printers to prospective clients. So if Nation 1 was issuing stamps and specimens had been created by the printers, they might send some of those marked specimen, defaced as such, to prospective clients in country 2. Post office training specimens were used by postal clerks when in training. I am sure there are some out there. I will tell you, I have never seen any. I would imagine those would be among the most common kinds of specimens because they were printed in large quantities for use in training sessions. Why they are not seen commonly, I don't know. I've never seen one on eBay. None of the dealers that I speak to have had any for sale, at least any for sale that they've shown to me. But they were issued in substantial quantities. Exhibition specimens were used by printers at the big printing events. How you would tell that from a printer's internal sample, you'd have to see what kind of a document it was pasted on. Philatelic specimens are when a postal authority has too many of these issued stamps in inventory. They want to get rid of them. They sold them to collectors, but they defaced them with the word specimen. And display specimens are the things you would see hanging near, in post offices, hanging near the wanted posters. When the post office wanted you to see what they had for sale, they'd put specimen stamps up in the windows as well. Press specimens were distributed, obviously, to press and media. And UPU specimens, which is the subject of this talk, in contrast to Marcus Samuel's statement, his definition, not every specimen stamp, certainly not the most recent of the specimen stamps, had that word printed across. Sometimes postal authorities just sent straight, unused mint stamps to the UPU for distribution to members. Here's a really great illustration of the first postal authority specimen. There are only 3 of these known to exist, but that's the penny black. It was issued by the General Post Office in April of 1840, a month before the issuance in May of the penny black. So this is an announcement to all the local post offices that these newfangled things called postage stamps were coming out the next month, and this is an instruction as to how to use them, how to deal with them, indeed how to sell them.
So it was just a fixed sort of paper,
yeah.
There's no specimen or print on it?
No, this is not a UPU specimen. This is a postal authority specimen, and they hadn't thought about it at the time. wasn't until the late 1850s or early 1860s that you actually start to see the word specimen used to prevent that stamp from being used postally. So no, this is just a communication between the General Post Office in Great Britain and the local post offices. So hundreds of these were sent around. Only 3 are known to survive. Sadly, this one is not in my collection. Okay, so here's a sheet of the penny black. That's also not in my collection. But specimens were cut. In the case of the penny black, which was an imperforate stamp, they were cut with scissors. A full sheet of 240 subjects gave you 12 stamps a row times 20 rows. This is an example of how the cutting of those original sheets would have taken place. As an example of a printer's sample proof, I show you this from Gambia, since that's what I'm collecting and that's what the subject of this talk is about. It's listed in Samuel's book as a printer's sample proof on unwatermarked paper. When I first saw this, when this first came to my attention, it looked to me like a forgery. It looked to me like a fake. It's imperforate. The color isn't quite right. It doesn't quite match the issued stamp in the 4-shilling denomination. So I was highly suspicious. I reached out to James Bendon, who is the ultimate authority in the world today on the subject, and he pointed out to me that, well, Samuel already had it in his book, and I should look more carefully at my own reference material. But yeah, it's legitimate. It's on unwatermarked paper in contrast to the issued stamp, which was on watermark. So this is the 4-shilling myrtle and orange. The DS1 is the Samuel designation of that particular specimen overprint mark. The printers had a variety of both overprints and perforations that they used, depending on the circumstance, or sometimes depending on whim, as far as I can determine. But there were a wide variety of different specimen formats that were used, and Samuel designated this as DS1. Looking at the key plate issues, which is the second series of issues coming out of Gambia, you can see here on the first key plate from 1898 to 1902 an example of a specimen stamp. This one happens to be on a variety of the Stanley Gibbons 39. And the reason is that you've got that distorted S in the word postage. So this is not just a 39S, which would be the designation for specimen, the 39A that was marked as a specimen. Here we have an example of a forged cameo issue, the cameo being the predecessor. This is the 1880 series. The first issue of stamp out of Gambia was 1869. So this is really the third series of printed stamps of the cameo. When I shared this one with James Bendon, his comment was, that's a destruction of an otherwise very nice stamp. It looks, that particular overprint specimen looks nothing like anything else that's seen, and that dot, that period at the end of the word, is not used anywhere else. So this is very clearly a specimen. when you get beyond singles in specimens, you get to multiples, of course. This is an example of UPU specimens in pairs. Now, stamps were distributed to the members of the UPU in particular quantities, depending on what the UPU called for. Sometimes 3 stamps, sometimes 5 stamps. For the most part, those were the 2 quantities that were handed off to the members of the UPU. In this case, this is a nice set from the Stanley Gibbons catalog series 108 to 116. It's a 1921 issue. Pairs are not all that common relative to the number of singles that are around, because mostly when a local postal authority received a collection of 3 or 5 stamps, they split them up and distributed them among the foreign exchange offices in each nation. It was only the foreign exchange offices that would care about incoming stamps. They were the first one to see an envelope when it showed up on shore or across the border. And so you would have either 3 or 5 offices where the UPU control office in a local country would split the stamps up and send it to 3 or 5 of the exchange offices. So it's only if a country had one exchange office that they would bother to keep a pair together. Otherwise, they were going to be splitting it up. So what's interesting about this set, not only are pairs pretty uncommon, but this one's got a number of varieties. The halfpenny and the 1 penny are both showing a club foot on the M, and the penny halfpenny and the 5 penny each show the broken M variety. So you can see here that club foot on the M, and here you can see the split M on the Gambia, on the split on the M in the word Gambia. There. It's probably the only set in existence that's got all of those varieties in a pair. I've seen other pairs of this series, but not with all of these varieties. All right, so here's an example of the first and simplest kind of multiple, a pair. But what kind of multiples are possible? For each series, for each time period, the UPU had different quantities required for distribution. So you can see, for example, on the first row during the Victorian key plate issue, which we saw earlier from 1898 to 1902, UPU required a total of 430 stamps. 5 were sent to each member. So from a pane of 60 stamps, you would have required 13 full sheets to have been printed, and that would have left you with an extra 50 stamps left over, probably retained by the printer as some form of printer specimen. Regardless of how many sheets were required or how many stamps were left over, the residuals were always retained by the printer and not shipped to the UPU. UPU didn't want any extras laying around. They wanted what they wanted. That's what they ordered, and that's what they got. The quantity required by the UPU in all except the first period included an additional stamp for its own archive. So just into the 1900s, I think it was in 1901, the regulation changed, and they added the stamp to create their own UPU archive. Before that, they didn't. All right, so here's a printed sheet of stamps. That's a full sheet, consists of 2 panes. Once these were printed, by and large, they were always separated into half sheets or panes, and that's what a single pane of 60 stamps would look like. These examples obviously aren't from Gambia, but I'm showing the structure of the sheet. So specimen stamps were torn, not cut. Certainly this is true during the period where we were perforating stamps, but they were processed, split into the required quantity. If a full pane was shipped, or if a full pane was required, or multiples of a full pane, it was up to the UPU how they were going to tear them from perforated sheets into the quantity required. So you'll see here, for example, that as the quantities changed, sometimes it was 5, then later on only 3 were required for each member postal authority. All right, so if we're dealing with a situation where 3 stamps were required, what the UPU would do is cut it into strips all the way across, a strip of 6, and then tear it down the center so that you would have 2 strips of 3 times 10 rows gave you 20 strips for distribution to the individual postal authorities. So a sheet of stamps gave you 20 distributions during the period when 3 per authority was required. On the other hand, no, because you got 10 rows down, you would have 1 left over at the bottom. It was simpler for them. Basically, they were just accordion folding it horizontally and then splitting it in half. And it was much simpler, and like any other clerical operation, the simpler the better. Why complicate things? On the other hand, when there were 5 required, it went the other way, because you had a column of 10, so I would accordion fold my sheet vertically, and I would have 12 per sheet, 6 across, 6 columns, if you will, across the top, and then that column of 10 would be split in half, and I would get 6 times 2, or 12 long strips, or vertical strips of 5 distributed to each member. And here's an example of just that. Here's an example from the 1898 Queen Victoria key plate that I showed a bit earlier. But here you see them in their original distribution form of 5 stamps for each of the 8 different denominations. So that's what you're going to see, is either at most a horizontal strip of 3 or a vertical strip of 5. So then the question becomes, how'd that happen? Why would that have happened? If the clerk at the UPU was interested in making his life simple, he would have done exactly what I just showed. Why is this happening? Well, it goes back to the quantity required. In 1905, when this was distributed, there were 5 stamps required and a total of 726. That odd number, the one stamp being the one that was retained in the UPU's archive. So we needed 726. That would have been 13 sheets, but 12 sheets would have given me 720, so I needed 6 more. Well, I'm not going to produce a partial sheet of overprints. The printer produced a full sheet of overprints and retained 54 for their archive. All right. So there were 145 members. They needed 725 individual stamps in strips of 5. And then an additional 5 stamps plus 1, an additional 6 stamps for that extra the 145th member. 144 came out exactly out of 12 sheets, and so the printer needed to send 6 stamps to the UPU from a broken sheet. What the printer elected to do was take that extra sheet, and instead of taking a strip of 6, which they could have done, it was really up to the clerk to decide how to split that second sheet. And what the clerk decided to do, for no policy or any other procedural reason, but strictly for convenience, is to take a block of 6, a 2x3 block of 6, off the corner of one of these sheets, and that's what got sent. So under normal circumstances, you would have had a strip of 5 distributed, but in this case, the UPU got a block of 6. It took its own stamp out of the lower right corner and sent a block of 5 rather than a strip of 5, because it didn't have one, and sent it to some unidentified French West African colony. I don't know which one. I'm not sure how anybody identified that it came from a French West African colony, but that's the explanation that came along with these stamps. What makes these so unusual is that it's not been seen anywhere before. I showed these to James Bendon before his book was complete, and he said he'd never seen anything like it, and if he hasn't, probably nobody has. He did a little bit more research. There's one other colony, I think it was a French colony, where a similar irregular block of 5 exists. These are the only 2 known examples, these 3 and that one French colony. So if you want to know how it happened, it was all because of the combination of the number of extra stamps that were needed off a sheet with residuals, and how some postal clerk decided to tear it off the full sheet. So if it was a mystery, there's the solution to it. But there's still a mystery that remains about these particular 3 blocks, or actually 2 of the 3 blocks. If you look at the 3-shilling stamp, the top 2 have perforation holes in them. And if you look at the bottom of the 2 shillings 6pence, you'll see there's also a perforation. Some have specified, and I've debated with those some, that it might be wormholes. Not uncommon in West African stamps to see something like that happen. In fact, quite common. Under a microscope, these can be seen to be identically sized and completely, precisely circular. They had to be hand punched. Now,
Why not the 116?
why not every stamp on the block? Yeah. So the question is, what's going on here? And the answer is, I don't know. And nobody else seems to either. I mean, the theory of wormholes was interesting, was the first alternative you turned to, because it's common in many stamps in that climate to get wormholes in stamps or any kind of paper. What's not common is to see the scans notwithstanding, under a microscope, it's very clear that those were machine punch of some sort. Now, postage stamps have been defaced very frequently, very commonly, mostly by printers, but by postal authorities as well. There are examples, to cite one, in the Silver Jubilee series, going back to, I think, Southern Rhodesia, where you will see stamps that have been defaced for all kinds of purposes, mostly by the printers as printers' proofs. Those are of a totally different diameter than what we have here. So I have been unable to tie this back to any other examples of machine or mechanically produced punch holes, and they are not wormholes. It's a mystery. I'm open to suggestions as to how it might happen. And what I did, the basis for this presentation today, is a paper that was printed recently in the June 2019 issue of Cameo, which is the Journal of the West African Studies Circle. I posed that question. Other than the idea that it's wormholes, nobody had a different explanation. But if you would like, you can download a copy of that paper as well as all of my published works. I store everything I write on academia.edu, which is a website that academics, which I am not, use for publishing their papers and distributing them widely. I'm a believer in the idea that philatelists who write owe it to the hobby to get their papers seen in a much more broad distribution than just within the hobby. The idea being to promote the hobby. So I put everything I do on academia.edu, and if you want to find everything, including this issue, this article, it's independent.academia.edu/Gary Loew. Let me close with another lesson about philately from Scott Adams. Dogbert is saying, will you help me look for valuable stamps? You're better at this than I am. And Dilbert's response is, philately will get you nowhere. Dilbert received the wrath of Dogbert. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it. Thank you for your interest. Have a great day.
So what is the evidence from the Madagascar archive, specimen archive, specimen archive? Do you see? But you also see blocks. You see blocks in that of stamps, right? Have you?
I'm not familiar with I mean, I'm aware that the Madagascar archive is being distributed. James has a lot of it on his website. I've not paid attention to blocks, truthfully. Are there?
I don't know. I mean, I don't. I doesn't collect stamps, so I don't really know. But the stationery, you see them old five, for instance.
Stationery was handled in a whole different manner. Well, because they were, let's say, the folded envelopes, they were printed one off, either folded or unfolded, and specimen marked, generally not defacing the stamp, but in the center of the envelope. So that's a whole different process.
Yeah, but you're still in the Madagascar archive. You're still pasting all those. I mean, if you've got five, pasting all five envelopes up. Okay. Mm-hmm. So they also have done that to the stamp. Okay, they probably pasted everything they got.
Yeah.
Because they just distributed it to anybody.
I mentioned that with some of the countries, they didn't bother using the word specimen. They just sent mint stamps. The only way you can tell that those are indeed specimens is if they come out of the archival books of the receiving countries, and you can tell those from log numbers. Mostly those, the sheets were razored out or torn out or whatever, and that's how those get distributed.
But that may be interesting to look at.
Yeah.
See how they receive specimens.
Yeah.
And if they probably pasted everything they got without the.
Yeah. For the most part, well, not for the most part. So I mean, some people, some nations kept them in absolute pristine condition. The gum is obviously unhinged. They didn't use hinged. Sometimes they would just lick the corner of the stamp and mount it in an archival book. So you will see the stamps have original gum, except in the upper right or upper left corner. That was just an individual thing that the different nations were doing. Okay.
Very, very interesting.
Thank you.
What's coming?
Thank you. I appreciate that.